Despite being the all-time master of counterpoint, that is, composing in many voices, Bach was far from a dry academician. No one can make a fancy fugal stretto dance like Bach can. It's true that his music can sound wooden and mechanical if it's played poorly, but when that happens, it's because the connection to the human body and its inclination to happily move has been severed. The technical term there is typewriter playing, and sadly, Bach is a frequent victim. We hear that all too often in auditions. A string of equal note values has a numbing effect on people, but if you find the melodic peaks and valleys, the varying degrees of tension and dissonance, the harmonic progressions all hidden in those seemingly ruthless 16th notes, typewriters will be a bygone. The infinite varieties of motion that Bach imagined couldn't be more obvious than in his many, many dance suites for orchestra, flute, violin, cello, and keyboard. The idea of a dance suite goes back to the Renaissance with its paired pavans and galliards. And the French clavecin, or keyboard composers, Jean-Philippe Rameau and François Couperin, Bach's contemporaries in the early 18th century, followed suite, so to speak, with enlarged harpsichord suites galore. For Bach, as well as Rameau and Couperin, the principal movements of the solo instrumental suites were the allemande, courante, sarabande, and gigue, each of which has a given set of characteristics in terms of meter, tempo, and dance steps. While Rameau's and Couperins were collected in more helter-skelter fashion, leave it to Bach to organize, catalog, and explore every crevice of the genre. For keyboard alone, he composed 3 sets of 6 suites each, the French suites, the English suites, and the partitas. The French suites are the shortest, since they lack the prelude movement, which opens every suite in the other sets, but otherwise the 3 sets parallel one another in both the order and variety of the dances, and so do the 6 suites for cello and the 6 partitas for violin. It should be quickly noted that the keyboard titles, French and English, tell us nothing about Bach's nationalistic sympathies. The French suites were probably named after Bach's death for no good reason whatsoever, and the English suites may merely refer to the English diplomat who commissioned them. What's more interesting is that every grouping comes in a set of 6, not just those for keyboard, but those for cello and violin as well. Bach was fascinated by numerology, and his mission in life was to create order. The number 6 in traditional numerology stands for familial harmony, though it may well have had other symbolic meanings for Bach as well. Whatever those meanings, the disarray inherent in, say, 5 French suites, 7 English, 9 partitas, 11 for strings, that would have made Bach suicidal. So 6 it is across the board. Other compositions feature different numerological arrangements. The Well-Tempered Clavier has 24 preludes and fugues, 4 times 6, 1 for each key. And he did that twice. The Goldberg variations have a more complex and intriguing scheme, a theme of 32 measures, and then 30 variations which are preceded and followed by a statement of the theme, meaning you have a theme of 32 measures and a piece with 32 parts. Perfect. The cantatas are filled with numerological references to the number 7, which symbolized the creator and creation, and the number 3, which stood for the Trinity. And those numerical references seep into secular works as well. Even the order of keys in his works tends to be meticulously patterned. The French suites are relatively loosely organized, moving only from 3 suites in minor keys to 3 in major. But other collections are tighter. The keys of the English suites move down systematically, stepwise, from A, with 1 in A major and 1 in A minor, all the way to D. And the keys of the partitas are the most remarkable. They fan out in both directions at increasingly greater distances. Thus, from the initial B flat, a single step up to C, a third down to A, a fourth up to D, a fifth down to G, and finally a sixth up to E. This is the same mind that could eye a fugue subject and know immediately how it would work in inversion, upside down, and in every conceivable combination with itself, its countersubject, its augmentation, and its diminution. A formidable mind, verging on inconceivable. But if you don't believe that Bach, strict Lutheran and composer of all those erudite canons, fugues, and motets, was above all an incorrigible dancer, the French suite that I'm going to play and talk about, number 5 in G major, should persuade you forever. The rhythm is irresistible, and so are the melodies. The textures here tend to be a bit thinner than in his fugues, and often one voice dominates the others. Perhaps this greater accessibility was partly planned because Bach wrote the suites as a birthday gift to his second wife, Anna Magdalena, who was a wonderful singer, but apparently had a little ways to go when it came to mastering the keyboard. So her husband undertook to instruct her, and somehow, while bearing 13 children, she still had time to learn. That's life before the internet, if you ask me. There are 7 movements in this suite, the 4 standard ones, which populate almost every dance suite, the Allemande, Courant, Sarabande, and Gigue, and 3 so-called gallantries, or optional short dances. If you want to remember the standard movements, try this. A child's stomach gurgles, A-C-S-G. That will give you a start. I think what strikes me most as I look for answers to what makes this music great is the simplicity of the materials. Mainly arpeggiated triads, that is 3-note chords, and little scales, mostly within a very small range. Debussy talks about Bach's use of the arabesque, quote, imbued with a wealth of free fantasy so limitless that it still astonishes us today. And that's true today, a century after Debussy. Arabesques, or little figures that curve up and down, figure prominently in all Bach's music, as they do in much art and architecture as well. Their combination of intricacy and simplicity, balance, and symmetry, all presented in modest proportions, is apparently endlessly appealing. So listen to this opening melody of the opening movement here, the Allemande. Allemandes are dances in a duple meter, that is a meter in 2 or a multiple of 2, played at a moderate tempo. And this one is particularly peaceful. Listen to how the voices intertwine in the very opening. I wonder if you heard how one voice imitates another in the gentlest way possible, both hinting at what's coming and reflecting on what's been played. Do you notice also the simple up and down? Direction seems to mean everything here. So does repetition. Listen to the sequences or repetitions of the same pattern on different pitches in the next portion. Here we go. And again. And now the other direction. And again. And again. And the last time. Sequences are at the very core of Baroque music. There's something enormously satisfying about them. I think we love easily recognizing these little snippets of material and following their ascents and descents. Repetition as a roadmap is a very, very comforting thing. Those patterns that you're hearing, all the arabesques twirling up and down in a very small range, are also all about intervals or the varying distance between notes. As the wonderful pianist Jeremy Denka said, Intervals are Bach's best friends. In this next excerpt, Bach moves from a scale-wise pattern to larger and larger leaps until he hits a very high note, thus giving it added emphasis with the biggest leap. Here we go, climbing. A third, a bigger third, a fourth, and finally a sixth. On almost any instrument other than the piano, including the voice, that leap of the sixth would take a little longer to traverse than the smaller distances preceding it. Pianists have to be taught to make it take longer. We play too easily by pushing buttons. One wants to feel a bit of the strain. That leap also happens at the peak of an excursion into the minor mode, which makes it even more worthy of extra attention. That simple shift between major and minor is a big deal. Listen to the oscillations here. I'll play it twice. Major, minor, major, minor, still minor, and back to major. Listen again. Major, minor, major, minor, minor, and back to major. Tonality is everything here. The tension of dissonance versus consonance, of chords and keys that are farther afield from the home key and the inevitable pull back to that home base. Let me play you the opening of the second half. You'll again hear Bach toying with that minor key, coming down and then building up through a sequence and finally marking the imminent cadence by way of the most dissonant moment in the dance. Here's what that moment sounds like. And now here's the entire passage. Our cadence here is in E minor, the relative minor of G major, or the minor key that has the same key signature as G major. It's going to make an appearance in all the dances, for it's the foil to the prevailing sunshine of that major key, and it has a very distinct personality. Let me play you the whole Allemande now, so you see the, quote, wealth of free fantasy with a more panoramic vision, and you can put those details into context. In general, the dances in a Bach suite alternate slower and faster tempos. That way, a suite of multiple movements achieves the emotional variety that the classical period aims for within a single movement or piece. So the next dance after an allemande needs to be fast. Its very name, courant or corrente, comes from the word to run. And this one lives up to its title. It's less complex than the allemande was, making do with only 2 voices rather than the 3 of the allemande, so that its motion isn't impeded. And it's in a triple rather than a duple meter, 3 beats per measure rather than 4, and that way Bach can provide alternation of meter as well as tempo between the dances. Listen to the right-hand scale that starts it off, immediately imitated by the left hand. That's followed by sequences and then more scales. Let me play it for you slowly. You'll hear how that's followed by more sequences and more scales and more imitation between the hands. Let me play the movement for you. Now we come to the real centerpiece of the suite, the sarabande. After the frolic of the courant, it's time to be slow and serious. 9 times out of 10, the sarabande is the most touching, most personal movement of the suite. Sarabandes, as we know them now, are always slow, but their history is more titillating than you might guess. In their early days in Spain, they were a fast dance, and they were judged so lascivious as to be impermissible. As a Jesuit priest lamented in the early 17th century, the sarabande is, quote, a dance and song so loose in its words and so ugly in its motions that it is enough to excite bad emotions in even very decent people. Well, thank God we're safe from all that in Bach's hands. Do not fear for your moral fiber as you listen. Content yourself with listening for the very chaste and innocent lilt of this music. Listen to how this one begins immediately with a beautiful melody, repeated with variation, and notice again how soothing and comforting that repetition is. We're back now to 3 voices with a much more complex texture, although still with one voice predominating. There's a lot more rhythmic variety in this movement than the other movements, many different note values flowing together rather than the stream of unvariegated sixteenths and eighths that made up the previous courant. Sarabandes are in triple meter, but are known for a characteristic stress on beat 2. You'll hear that particularly right in the opening measures. Adding to the beauty of that line, chaste or otherwise, is the abundance of what we call ornamentation. In just those 2 bars, we have ornaments on every other beat. Here, again, again, there as well. Ornamentation is a thorny subject, and the question of how much of it goes where is the subject of many a tome. I'll spare you the gory details, but suffice it to say that Baroque music, the music written between about 1600 and 1750, abounds in ornaments. It's been compared to ornate Baroque architecture. And even when they aren't written down by the composer, it's assumed that the performer will add their own. In a movement like this, the tradition would be that when each half gets repeated, and the dances are all in a binary form, that is with 2 halves, each one with a repeat sign, the creative performer would play variants, adding little trills, rolls, or flourishes to provide variety. Bach writes the opening of the second half, for instance, practically without any ornaments. Without ornaments, it sounds like this. One might play it that way the first time, but add on a few additional notes the second time. So here's the saraband, played without repeats, but with ornaments that might well appear a second time through. After the saraband, the audience needs release, and this is where the composer usually inserts a couple of gallantries or optional dances. In this suite, we get a gavotte, a bourrée, and a louré. The gavotte and bourrée are jolly and straightforward, both fast dances. Notice how a lot of the articulation, particularly of the gavotte, is detached rather than legato or connected, as it was in the more songful allemande and saraband. Those are choices that the performer makes, since Bach rarely indicates articulation. But there are long traditions governing such choices. Frequently, the decisions are based on whether notes are moving in skips or steps, skipping intervals generally encouraging a skipping articulation as well. You'll hear it here. And then more legato. Both of these dances feature a second half that turns the first half upside down. So, the gavotte begins. And its second half begins. And the bourrée begins like this. And its second half begins like this. We'll see that again when we look at the gigue. Finally, before I play the gavotte and the bourrée for you, be sure to listen for the outsized role that triads play in these pieces. Remember I said that Bach used the simplest building blocks possible. Well, listen to the opening of the bourrée, and there you have a case in point. The left hand is cavorting through arpeggiated triads, and pretty soon the right hand follows suit with little scale-wise arabesques thrown in for good measure. It sounds like this. Now, here are the gavotte and the bourrée in their entirety. Perhaps you're noticing subconsciously, if not consciously, the overwhelming preponderance of G major here. G major, and then again G major. It takes a very talented composer to stay in one key for such a long time and not bore us to tears. Bach obviously has talent. So he manages to make what comes next, despite again being in G major and based on G major triads, a total surprise. It's a so-called louré, and you're not alone if you've never heard of it. This is the only louré in any of Bach's suites, and it's a curious dance. Its rhythm sort of staggers. I literally have to beat it out to myself every time I reapproach it after even a brief absence. This is what I do. You can hear I'm kind of staggering too. It's an old French dance, elegant and melancholy with an antiquated air. And this movement provides a good example of the role that register can play in highlighting imitation. Each voice speaks with such a clear and stately identity according to its placement on the keyboard. All that pleasurable melancholy, whether high or low on the piano, is dispensed in the final jig. Jigs are descendants of old jigs, and they tend to romp along in rapid triplet formations. They're often fugal, though, with a sparse texture. This one is particularly tearful. Here's the opening subject and its statement in 3 voices. It boasts a second half, which is based on the inversion of that subject. So here was the original. And here's the inversion. We've already seen less formal inversions in the gavotte and the bourrée, and that's something Bach likes to do a lot. It's reminiscent of the fugal procedures in the well-tempered clavier that we talked about in the last lecture, but it isn't limited to fugues. In fact, the prelude to the A minor prelude and fugue that I played for you last time, which, like these dances, is also in binary form, has a second half that's an inversion of the first. Here's how it began. And here's how the second half begins. This jig, though, features far less angst and fewer complexities, just sheer, unadulterated joy. It feels like such a festive gathering, more and more guests arriving, more and more voices joining the party. It's unlikely that people were actually dancing to this music by Bach's time, and some of the dances were indeed long out of fashion. But the challenge for the pianist is to make you, the 21st century audience, feel that allemands and courants and sarabands and jigs are alive and well. The piano's keys go down, as do the pianist's fingers, but in fact, we're always trying to spring upward. Playing the piano has been called an exercise in anti-gravity, and my hope is that that jig has made you feel both less grave and decidedly less earthbound.